The forest was supposed to be quiet that night, but a sudden storm turned the sky black, and deep among the trees, a wounded child lay crying, alone, unable to walk. A retired veteran and his K9 were just passing through until the dog stopped, ears locked, sensing something terribly wrong. What they found beneath a fallen tree wasn't just a lost boy, but a hidden place that had been buried for decades, and a choice that would change all of their lives forever. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Ashland, Oregon sat at the edge of the Rogue Valley like a quiet town that had learned to live with extremes. Bright, clean mornings that smelled of pine resin and sun-baked dust, and late summer afternoons that could turn harsh without warning, heat pressing down until the air felt thin. It was the last week of August, the kind of end-of-season stretch locals talked about with a tired shrug, wildfire haze drifting in from distant ridgelines, a pale sun behind a veil, and wind that could change direction in minutes and make every dry branch sound like it might snap. Mason Caldwell rolled into town in an older, sand-colored pickup with a dented rear-quarter panel and a tarp tied down over a few plastic bins. He looked 38, but carried himself older. Broad shoulders, a thick neck, and the kind of lean strength that comes from hauling weight and sleeping poorly rather than lifting for show. His hair was cut close, dark brown with early gray at the temples, and a short beard shadowed his jaw, kept trimmed more from habit than style. He wore a faded olive work shirt with the sleeves rolled and a ball cap pulled low, not to hide exactly, but to make the world smaller. The cap couldn't conceal the small tells, the way his eyes scanned storefront windows for reflections, the way his posture tightened whenever a truck backfired 2 streets over, the way he paused half a beat before stepping through any doorway like he wanted to see the whole room at once. That vigilance had a history. Mason had done 2 deployments as a combat engineer, the kind of job where you learn to read dirt and wires and shadows, where the ground itself could be a weapon. He had come home with medals that sat in a box and a nervous system that never got the memo the war was over. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Rex, an 8-year-old Belgian Malinois with a dark muzzle and intelligent amber eyes, muscular but not bulky, built like a coiled spring. Rex wore a simple harness with a handle at the back, scuffed from use, and he moved with a restrained precision that made people step aside without knowing why. Rex wasn't a pet in the sentimental sense. He was a working dog who had learned to trust Mason's voice in chaos, and Mason had learned to trust Rex's instincts when his own thoughts ran too loud. They had the same tired steadiness, the same quiet refusal to be surprised. Ashland's center was charming in a postcard way, brick sidewalks, bookshops, a couple of cafes, banners for the theater season fluttering weekly in the heat. But Mason didn't linger. He kept driving, passing the park where families clustered under the thin shade of maples and past the trailhead signs that promised cool forests just beyond the town's edge. He wasn't here for the plays or the wine bars or the curated calm. He was here because the map showed trees and distance and fewer people, and because in a town like this, a man could exist without being asked too many questions if he kept his head down and paid in cash. He stopped at a small general store on the outskirts, one of those places where the bell over the door still rang and the floorboards creaked. Inside, the air conditioning struggled, smelling faintly of cardboard and motor oil. The clerk behind the counter was a woman in her early 40s named Sarah Keene, a practical kind of beautiful that came from being clean and capable rather than styled. She was tall and wiry, with sun-browned skin and freckles across her nose, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun that looked like it had been twisted up without a mirror. Her eyes were a clear gray blue, the color of overcast sky, and they measured people quickly, not with suspicion, but with the reflex of someone who had learned to be careful in a small town that pretended nothing bad happened. A thin scar crossed one knuckle on her right hand, and her forearms were corded from work. When she looked at Rex, her expression softened for a second in the way people do when they recognize discipline in an animal. "He's a serious one," she said. nodding toward the dog as Mason set a jug of water, a pack of jerky gauze wraps, a roll of athletic tape, and a cheap flashlight on the counter. Her voice had the plain cadence of someone who didn't waste words. Mason gave a brief, polite half-smile that never reached his eyes. "He's working," he replied. Sarah's gaze flicked to Mason's hands, knuckles scarred, nails short, the faint whitened line along the base of his thumb like an old burn, and then to the way he stood with his back angled so he could see both the door and the aisle. She didn't comment. She just rang him up and slid a laminated map across the counter. "If you're heading out past Dead Indian Memorial Road, cell service drops fast," she said, "and the wind's been weird. Fire danger's not a joke right now." Mason tapped the map once, acknowledging without promising anything. Sarah hesitated, then added, softer, "You got a place to sleep?" Mason's jaw tightened as if the question had weight. "Cabin," he said, "short term." Sarah nodded like she'd heard that answer 100 times from people who didn't want to be known. "Well," she said, pushing his receipt toward him, "if you need a ranger number, it's on the back. And if your dog gets into trouble, there's a vet on Highway 66. Tell them Sarah sent you." Mason paused, surprised by the direct kindness, and gave a single nod. Outside, the heat hit like an open oven, the haze muting the mountains into blue-gray silhouettes. He drove another 20 minutes until the road narrowed and the town fell away behind him. The cabin was more a weathered shed someone had once called livable. One room, a small porch, a rusted stove, and windows clouded with dust. It sat tucked into the trees, not deep wilderness but far enough that the silence had room to spread. Mason unloaded his bins with efficient movements, setting up like he had learned to do overseas. Essentials first, the rest later. Rex trotted the perimeter, nose low, reading the land in a language Mason could never fully speak. The afternoon dragged hot and dry, the forest holding its breath. By evening, the temperature dropped sharply, the kind of swing that made the air feel brittle. Mason ate standing up, jerky and crackers, then sat on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees. The sky was a washed-out purple above the tree line, and far off, a faint orange glow hinted at a wildfire miles away, harmless for now, but present like a reminder. Rex lay at Mason's feet, alert even while resting, ears twitching at every distant rustle. When darkness settled, it didn't bring peace, it brought sound. Wind through needles, small animals moving underbrush, the occasional crack of deadwood. Mason lay on the narrow bed, boots off but within reach, listening with the same focus he once used to listen for radio static or the wrong kind of silence. He wasn't frightened in a simple way. He was braced, as if the world owed him a hit, and he was determined not to be caught leaning. Sometime after midnight, Rex stood up, not with urgency, but with purpose. He went to the door and pressed his nose against the seam, inhaling. A low, controlled whine vibrated in his chest. Quiet enough it could be missed, but Mason heard it immediately. He sat up, the motion smooth and practiced, and reached for his flashlight. "What is it?" he murmured, voice calm by force. Rex's ears angled forward, another whine, then a single soft huff. Mason opened the door, and cool air spilled in, carrying a scent that wasn't pine or dust, metallic, sharp. Rex stepped onto the porch and froze, head turned slightly toward the trees. In the dim, Mason saw it too, a smear on the porch rail where something had brushed past, dark and wet enough to catch faint starlight. Blood. Rex looked back at Mason, eyes steady, as if asking permission. Mason's throat tightened, not from fear, but from the old instinct to respond. He clipped the leash to Rex's harness and stepped off the porch into the night, following the dog toward the black line of the forest where the wind had started to pick up, sudden and uneasy, as if the season itself was warning that whatever waited out there was not going to be gentle. The forest beyond the cabin swallowed sound in layers, needles softening Mason Caldwell's steps while Rex pulled steadily ahead, leash loose but purposeful. The wind had picked up since sunset, not a clean gust but a shifty current that slid through the trees and changed its mind every few seconds. Mason clicked the flashlight on low and kept it angled to the ground. He didn't want a beam cutting the dark like a blade. He wanted depth, context, the shape of what lay ahead. Rex's paws moved with a precision that betrayed his age. 8 years old now, joints not as forgiving as they once were, but his posture stayed tight, tail level, ears triangulating sound. The Malinois' coat, sable and black, caught the faint light and made him look carved from shadow. They followed the smear of blood past the tree line, where the slope dipped and the forest floor turned slick with dry leaves layered over dust. Mason smelled it before he saw it again. Iron and sweat, the metallic tang sharp enough to override pine. Rex stopped at the edge of a shallow ravine where rainwater had once carved a channel. He lowered his head, inhaled, then looked back at Mason, eyes steady, waiting. Mason nodded. Permission given. Down in the ravine, the wind funneled and the temperature dropped. The beam of the flashlight caught on a torn strip of fabric snagged on a bramble. Cheap cotton, dark blue, the kind of hoodie kids wore when they didn't know what else to wear. Mason crouched and touched it with 2 fingers. Fresh. The blood trail thickened here, droplets heavier, more careless, the mark of someone moving fast and failing. Rex whined once, a soft sound that carried worry rather than alert. They found him 50 yards farther on, just beyond a stand of young firs. The boy lay half on his side, half on his back, breathing shallow, his right leg bent at an angle that made Mason's jaw tighten. He couldn't have been more than 12. Thin frame, too big hoodie bunched at his shoulders, hair dark and plastered to his forehead with sweat. His skin was pale under the flashlight, freckles standing out like pinpricks. When the light brushed his face, his eyes opened wide, hazel, glassy with shock, and his hands scrabbled weakly at the ground. "Hey," Mason said, keeping his voice level and low, the tone he used to keep panicked soldiers from bolting. "You're okay, don't move." The lie was necessary. Truth could wait. He clipped the leash to Rex's harness handle and set the dog into a down beside the boy. Rex complied instantly, body pressed to the earth, head angled toward the child. The boy's breathing stuttered, then slowed when Rex leaned forward and placed his chin gently against the boy's wrist. The contact was deliberate, trained and kind. I slipped," the boy whispered, words catching. "I was trying to—" His teeth chattered despite the warmth. Mason scanned him quickly. No obvious head wound, pupils reactive, hands shaking. The leg was the problem. Closed fracture, likely tibia or fibula, swelling already visible through the fabric. Blood soaked the knee from a split in the skin, not arterial, but enough to demand attention. Mason took off his cap and set it aside, then shrugged out of his shirt with practiced speed, tearing a strip from the hem. "What's your name?" Mason asked as he knelt. He moved slowly, narrating each step because control calmed people, especially children. "Elliot," the boy said. "Elliot Harper." "Okay, Elliot. I'm Mason. This is Rex. He's with me." He met Elliot's eyes and held them. "I'm going to help you. It's going to hurt some, but I won't do anything without telling you first." Elliot nodded once, jaw clenched. Mason cleaned the wound with water from his jug, apologizing under his breath as the boy hissed. He palpated gently, confirming what he already knew. They couldn't move fast and they couldn't stay exposed. The wind shifted again, stronger now, carrying a distant rumble that wasn't thunder yet but wanted to be. Mason glanced upslope and spotted it, a massive oak toppled years ago, roots torn from the earth and lifted like a frozen wave. Beneath the root ball yawned a dark pocket where soil and stone had collapsed inward, a hollow that could break wind and shed rain. Not a cave in the romantic sense, but shelter. Enough. He slid one arm under Elliot's shoulders and another under his good knee. "We're going to move to that tree," he said. "I'll carry you." The weight was lighter than Mason expected. Elliot's body was all angles and bones, the heft of a kid who hadn't grown into himself yet. Rex paced tight circles, alert to every sound, until Mason set Elliot down inside the hollow. The space smelled of damp earth and old leaves, cool and stale but dry. Mason propped Elliot's leg with a pack, then worked the splint, 2 straight branches padded with torn cloth, wrapped and secured with tape. He tightened until Elliot's breathing steadied, then checked circulation, fingers warm, capillary refill good. Outside, the forest exhaled a warning. The wind snapped harder, branches clattering like dropped cutlery. The sky went from hazed gray to a bruised purple in minutes, and the first drops of rain came fast and heavy, punching into the dirt and turning dust to paste. Mason pulled his jacket over Elliot's shoulders and shifted so his own body blocked the opening. Rex sat at the threshold, back straight, eyes forward, a sentry carved from muscle and intent. When the storm broke, it did so without ceremony. Rain hammered the leaves and thunder rolled close enough to make the ground tremble. Water sluiced down the slope but diverted around the root ball, pooling harmlessly away from them. Elliot flinched at a crack of thunder, then pressed his face into Mason's sleeve. "My mom's going to be mad," Elliot said, the fear leaking out sideways. "I was supposed to be home." "Where's home?" Mason asked, not prying, just opening a door. "Near the high school," Elliot said. "My stepdad doesn't like it when I'm late." Mason didn't comment. He had learned the value of silence. He focused on the storm, on Rex's breathing, on the way the dog's ears flicked at each thunderclap, but his body stayed anchored. Time stretched, then compressed. The rain eased to a steady drench, and with it came a smell Mason recognized from old patrols. Wet stone. It wasn't just soil and leaves, there was mineral in it, cold and clean. Mason turned the flashlight deeper into the hollow and froze. The light caught a seam in the earth behind the root ball, a line too straight to be chance. He shifted closer, careful not to disturb Elliot's leg, and brushed away clotted dirt. Stone emerged, fitted tight, the edge of a slab hidden by years of debris. Rex rose, hackles lifting just enough to signal interest, and nosed the seam. The dog's paw scratched once, twice. The stone gave a fraction, a sound like a held breath released. "Mason?" Elliot whispered. "I see something," Mason said, heart thudding, not with fear, but with the old familiar pull of the unknown. He wedged his fingers into the gap and levered gently. The slab shifted, revealing a narrow opening beyond, darker than the hollow, air moving faintly as if the earth itself were breathing. The smell of wet stone grew stronger, tinged with old metal. Thunder cracked overhead closer than before, and a surge of rain splashed against the opening. Mason weighed options with the speed of habit. The hollow was safe for now, but if the storm worsened, water could rise. The opening behind the slab sloped inward and down, dry at the threshold. He met Rex's eyes, the dog's tail stilled, his focus sharp. Not danger, not yet. "We might need to go a little farther in," Mason said to Elliot, voice steady. "Just until the storm passes. I won't move your leg." Elliot swallowed, then nodded. "Okay." Mason repositioned, easing Elliot backward on his pack, inch by inch, into the shadowed passage. Rex went first, shoulders brushing stone, then sat just inside, blocking wind and rain. The storm roared outside, but in the narrow space beyond the slab, the sound dulled, turning distant and manageable. Mason clicked the flashlight brighter and swept the beam across rough-hewn walls that opened into a wider chamber than he'd expected. The floor was dry. The air was still. Mason didn't know yet what they'd found. He only knew that the forest had offered them shelter twice in one night, and that sometimes the line between refuge and revelation was as thin as a seam in the earth. The passage narrowed after the first few steps, forcing Mason Caldwell to angle his shoulders and keep the flashlight low so the beam skimmed stone instead of flattening it. The walls were cool to the touch, damp only in patches, the air moving just enough to tell him the space extended farther than a simple animal burrow. Rex went ahead at a measured pace, claws clicking softly, body language alert but not alarmed. The dog's age showed most in moments like this. 8 years had tempered his speed, but sharpened his judgment. He paused when needed, waited when Mason's hand lifted, checked corners with a patience that had been learned the hard way. Elliot lay on the pack, Mason dragged carefully behind him, jaw tight, fingers white where they gripped the fabric. The boy didn't cry. He breathed through the pain the way Mason had coached him to, eyes fixed on the narrow cone of light like it was something solid he could hold on to. The passage opened gradually, not with a sudden reveal, but with a quiet widening, the ceiling lifting, the walls stepping back. Mason felt the shift in his chest before he saw it. Space had a sound, a way of carrying breath. He stopped and swept the beam in a slow arc. They stood in a chamber carved by hands, not water. Tool marks were visible where stone had been cut and smoothed, crude but deliberate. The floor sloped gently downward and leveled off into a wide basin of compacted earth. It was dry, Old dry. The kind of dry that came from years of protection from weather. Mason exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. Rex stepped forward and sniffed the ground, then circled once and sat, not guarding, not warning, claiming the space as acceptable. Mason took that as permission. He eased Elliot down and propped his leg again, checking the splint. The swelling hadn't worsened, and the boy's color was better in the steadier air. Thunder rolled beyond the stone, muffled now, a distant argument they were no longer part of. "Are we underground?" Elliot asked, voice small but steady. "Yeah," Mason said, "not deep, but deep enough." He scanned the walls again, taking inventory the way he always did when the world shifted unexpectedly. There were old wooden braces set into the stone, gray with age, some cracked, some still stubbornly holding. Iron spikes jutted at regular intervals, rusted to the color of dried blood. Near the far wall, half buried in dust, lay the remains of crates collapsed into themselves, wood slats split, iron bands bowed. Mason crouched and brushed one with his fingers. The wood crumbled to powder. "Someone was here a long time ago," Elliot said. "A long time," Mason agreed. The flashlight beam caught a glint near the base of the far wall. Mason moved closer, careful where he put his weight, and knelt. Coins. Not scattered, but pooled as if they had spilled and been left. Silver dulled by time, edges worn smooth by handling rather than water. He didn't touch them. He didn't need to. The shape of the place told the story well enough. This wasn't a cave made by accident. It was a cache, hidden and forgotten. Rex rose and nosed a stack of stone to the left. The beam followed and found a narrow alcove deeper than the rest of the chamber, the ceiling lower, the walls close. A metal box sat there, iron sides flaking, latch intact but fused by rust. Mason's pulse ticked up, not with greed, but with the familiar tension of proximity. Unknowns carried weight. He rested a hand on Rex's harness, grounding himself, and leaned back on his heels. "We're not opening anything," he said, more to himself than to Elliot. "Not tonight." Elliot nodded quickly. "I don't care about it," he said. "I just want my leg to stop hurting." Mason smiled despite himself, the expression brief and private. He rummaged in his pack and handed Elliot a sip of water, then a strip of jerky. The boy chewed carefully, eyes roaming the chamber. There was fear there, yes, but also curiosity. Kids were resilient like that. They bent toward light even in strange places. As the storm raged outside, Mason took stock of time. His watch said they'd been in the chamber less than an hour, though it felt longer. He tested his radio. Static, then nothing. Too much rock, too much weather. He'd have to wait for a break. He settled into a watchful stillness, back against stone, Rex at his side, Elliot asleep in fits, the pain finally dulled by exhaustion. The quiet pressed in, not threatening, just present. In that quiet, Mason's thoughts drifted, as they sometimes did when his hands were busy and the world demanded patience. He thought of the men he'd known who would have pried open the box without a second thought, and of the men who had learned to leave well enough alone. He thought of Sarah at the store, of her scarred knuckle and careful kindness, of how she'd named the danger without drama. He thought of how the forest had offered shelter twice, and what that said about listening. Rex stirred suddenly, head lifting, ears angling. Mason followed the line of the dog's attention toward the passage. The sound came a moment later, a distant, rhythmic clatter, not thunder, not rain. Hooves, one animal, moving cautiously over uneven ground. Mason's hand tightened on the flashlight. He clicked it off and waited, counting breaths. The sound grew clearer, then paused. A voice drifted faintly through the stone, muffled but human. "Easy, girl," it said, calm and low. Easy. Mason's heart rate spiked and settled. He weighed risk and need with the speed of habit. He clicked the flashlight on and stood, keeping his body between the passage and Elliot. Rex rose with him, silent, focused. A figure appeared at the mouth of the passage, framed by rain-dimmed light. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and spare, shoulders stooped more from habit than age. A gray beard covered his jaw in a way that suggested neglect rather than fashion, and rain darkened the brim of his hat and the canvas jacket that hung loose on his frame. His eyes were sharp under heavy brows, assessing before reacting. Behind him, half visible in the storm, stood a bay horse, head low, mane plastered to its neck, reins looped casually in the man's hand. The horse's flanks were lean, muscles roped and practical, the look of an animal used to work rather than show. "Didn't expect company," the man said, raising one hand to show it was empty. His voice carried the steadiness of someone who had spent a lot of time alone and learned to speak carefully when he wasn't. Mason didn't lower the flashlight. "We're sheltering," he said. "Kid's hurt." The man nodded once, slow. "Name's Tom Kersey," he said. "I checked the backcountry for the county. Old habit." He glanced at Rex, approval flickering. "Dog's trained." "Is," Mason said. Tom stepped just far enough in that the reins stopped drumming his shoulders. He took in the chamber with a practiced eye, gaze snagging on the collapsed crates, the iron box in the alcove. He didn't move toward it. His attention went back to Elliot. "That leg looks bad," he said, not unkindly. "You did right splinting it." Mason inclined his head, acknowledging competence. "Storm will pass," he said. "Then I'll get him out." Tom nodded again. "Road's a mess right now," he said, "but I can ride to the ridge when the rain eases. Radio from there." He met Mason's eyes, and something unspoken settled between them. Respect, cautious, and earned. "This place," Tom added, glancing at the chamber, "has a way of pulling people in when the weather turns. You didn't break anything?" "No," Mason said. "Didn't touch." "Good," Tom said simply. They waited together then, 3 humans and a dog and a horse, the storm losing its voice beyond the stone. Mason felt the weight of the night easing, not gone, but managed. He looked down at Elliot, asleep again, breath even. He looked at Rex, steady and sure. He looked at the iron box, untouched, and knew with a certainty that surprised him that some doors were meant to be opened slowly, if at all. When the rain finally softened to a whisper, Tom shifted his weight and nodded toward the passage. "When it breaks," he said, "we'll move. No rush. We do this clean." Mason nodded back. The plan was simple. The night had given them enough. Morning did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the chamber in diluted shades, a thin gray that softened edges and turned the rough stone into something almost gentle. The storm had spent itself in the night. What remained was the after silence, broken only by water dripping somewhere deep in the rock and the slow, patient breathing of the horse outside. Mason Caldwell woke with the instinctive start of someone who never trusted quiet. He took inventory without moving. Elliot asleep but breathing evenly, the splint still firm. Rex alert at his side, ears relaxed but ready. Tom Kersey leaning against the wall near the passage, hat tipped forward, eyes open. The iron box in the alcove sat untouched, dust unbroken. Good. Tom shifted first, straightening with a small groan that belonged to a man who had earned his aches honestly. In the pale light, his face showed its lines clearly, deep creases at the corners of his eyes, a weather-beaten nose, beard shot through with white. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to conserve effort after a long life outdoors. "Rain's done," he said quietly. "Wind's down too. We've got a window." Mason nodded and rose, rolling his shoulders to shake off stiffness. He checked Elliot's leg again, testing circulation, adjusting the padding where it had compressed overnight. Elliot woke during the check, blinking against the light, pain flickering across his face, and then settling as Mason's hand steadied the splint. "We're getting you out," Mason said, slow and careful. Outside, the forest looked rinsed, leaves glistened, and the air carried the clean, sharp smell that came only after heavy rain, soil, stone, and something green and living beneath it all. Tom's horse waited just beyond the passage, head low, reins slack over one arm. In daylight, the animal showed its age and competence, a bay mare with a white star on her forehead, flanks roped with muscle, legs scarred lightly from brush and rock. She stood calm despite the tight space and unfamiliar scents, eyes soft, ears swiveling to track voices. Tom patted her neck. "This is Hazel," he said, a note of fondness threading his voice. "She'll carry what we ask, but she won't be rushed." Mason appraised the mare and nodded. He trusted animals that held themselves like that. "We'll need a litter," he said. Tom smiled thinly. "Already thought of it." He stepped outside and returned with a folded tarp and 2 straight poles he'd cached near the entrance years ago. Never hurts to plan for the worst, he added, as if explaining a personal philosophy rather than a habit. They worked without fuss. Mason directed, Tom assisted, Rex watched. The litter went together cleanly, knots cinched tight. Elliot endured the transfer with clenched teeth and quiet courage, gripping the edge of the tarp while Mason talked him through each movement. When they lifted him, Hazel shifted her weight to brace, accepting the load as if she understood its importance. Rex paced once, then settled into position at Mason's knee, a moving perimeter. They emerged into a forest transformed. The slope beyond the root ball had shed debris. Rivulets cut new lines through the soil, but the footing held. Mason took the front, eyes scanning, flashlight stowed now that daylight did the work. Tom led Hazel behind him. The mare's steps measured, sure. Elliot lay still, watching the canopy slide by overhead, fear receding into a tired, stunned wonder. Halfway up the ravine, Mason heard it, the distant thrum of an engine, faint but real. He stopped and listened. The sound grew, then resolved into a pickup easing along the ridge road. Tom's mouth twitched. "That'll be the Ranger," he said. "She's stubborn about checking after storms." They reached the road as the truck pulled into view, mud-splashed and practical. The driver stepped out, a woman in her early 30s with a Ranger green jacket and dark hair braided down her back. She was average height and athletic, her posture easy but attentive, eyes sharp beneath the brim of her cap. A radio clipped to her shoulder crackled softly. She took in the scene in a glance, boy on a litter, splint, dog at heel, horse calm, and adjusted without drama. "Name's Leah Moreno," she said, voice clear. "U.S. Forest Service." She knelt by Elliot, her hands steady, her questions precise. When she looked up at Mason, there was respect there, unforced. "Good work," she said. "We'll get him to Medford. Ambulance is already on the way." Elliot's eyes filled, relief breaking through the pain at last. Mason squeezed his shoulder once, firm. "You did great," he said. Rex nudged Elliot's hand gently, a final reassurance. As they waited, Leah's gaze drifted toward the trees, then back to Mason and Tom. "Any hazards we need to mark?" she asked. Tom met Mason's eyes, then looked back at Leah. "There's a place," he said carefully. "Shelter under a root ball. Leads to an old chamber." Leah stilled. "Anything disturbed?" "No," Mason said. "We left it as we found it." Leah studied him a beat longer, then nodded. "That's the right call." She stood and spoke into her radio, concise and measured, flagging a location without naming it. "We'll handle it properly." The ambulance arrived with a muted urgency that didn't shatter the calm. Paramedics moved Elliot onto a gurney, checked vitals, praised his bravery. Mason stepped back as procedures took over, hands empty now, a familiar hollow opening in his chest when responsibility passed on. Elliot caught his sleeve. "You're coming, right?" Mason shook his head gently. "They'll take you faster without me. I'll see you soon." It was a promise he hadn't fully examined yet, but he meant it. After the ambulance pulled away, the forest seemed to exhale again. Leah lingered, jotting notes. Tom leaned against Hazel's shoulder, fatigue finally showing. Rex sat, tongue lolling slightly, tension easing from his frame. Leah closed her notebook. "I'll file this by the book," she said. "That chamber, if it's what I think it is, will secure it. History belongs to everyone, but safety comes first." She glanced at Mason. "You didn't try to be a hero." Mason shrugged. "Just did the job in front of me." She smiled at that, brief and genuine. "Sometimes that's the heroic part." She hesitated, then added, "If you're staying in the area, we could use people who know how to move in the backcountry without tearing it up." Mason considered the offer, feeling its weight without yet taking it on. "I'll think about it," he said. Leah nodded, accepting the boundary, and drove off, tires crunching gravel. Tom mounted Hazel with a grunt, settling into the saddle like it had been waiting for him. "You handled that right," he said to Mason. "Most folks don't." Mason looked back toward the trees where the root ball hid the chamber again. "Some things are bigger than us," he said. "Best to leave them intact." Tom's eyes crinkled. "You sound like someone who's learned the hard way." Mason didn't answer. He whistled once and Rex rose, ready. They walked back down the road together for a few minutes, then Tom turned off toward a trail Mason hadn't noticed before. Hazel's hooves faded into the woods. Mason returned to the cabin as the sun climbed, the air warming but no longer oppressive. He cleaned his hands, checked his gear, and sat on the porch steps with Rex at his side. The forest was quiet in a new way now, not empty, but settled. Mason felt the night's tension loosen, replaced by something tentative and unfamiliar. Purpose, maybe, or the first outline of it. He stood at last and looked toward town. There would be questions. There would be choices. For now, he had done enough. Rex leaned against his leg, solid and real, and Mason let the moment hold. The hospital in Medford smelled like antiseptic and wet pavement, a combination that Mason Caldwell recognized too well. He sat in a molded plastic chair, with Rex lying at his feet, the dog's chin resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. Morning light slanted through the windows, pale and clinical, flattening the world into surfaces and edges. Mason preferred forests to rooms like this. Rooms demanded answers. Still, he stayed. He had promised Elliot Harper he would see him soon, and Mason kept promises the way he kept tools, clean, ready, non-negotiable. Elliot was in surgery for a clean set and pins, the orthopedic nurse had said, efficient and kind. The boy's mother arrived an hour later, breathless and pale, clutching her purse with both hands as if it anchored her. Her name was Marianne Harper, early 40s, average height, soft around the edges from a life that had required endurance more than rest. Her brown hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, strands escaping to frame a face marked by worry lines that had earned their place. She wore jeans and a cardigan despite the warmth, a habit of comfort rather than fashion. When she saw Elliot's shoes in a clear plastic bag by the nurse's station, she covered her mouth and cried silently, shoulders shaking. Mason stood and waited, giving her the space to gather herself before he spoke. "Ms. Harper," he said gently, "I'm Mason. I found your son." She turned, eyes red but sharp, and studied him the way mothers do when their children are hurt, measuring intent before gratitude. Her gaze dropped to Rex, then lifted back to Mason's face. "Thank you," she said, the words raw. "They told me what you did." "They said you didn't leave him." Mason nodded once. "He was brave," he said. "Did what he needed to do." Marianne swallowed and nodded, as if the idea of her son being brave steadied something inside her. "His stepfather's on the way," she added, then stopped, uncertainty flickering across her features. We don't always agree." Mason didn't comment. He had learned that families carried their own weather, and it wasn't his place to predict storms. The stepfather arrived not long after. Caleb Wright was a tall man in his late 40s, shoulders squared by habit rather than build, his posture stiff in a way that suggested control was important to him. He wore work boots and a button-down shirt tucked too neatly into his jeans, as if order itself were armor. His jaw was angular, shaved clean, and his eyes were restless, scanning the room for something to fix or fault. When Marianne spoke to him, his replies were clipped, his hand tapping an anxious rhythm against his thigh. Whatever had shaped him, long hours, disappointments, the quiet pressure of being right, had taught him to keep feelings on a short leash. Caleb stopped when he saw Mason and Rex. "Who's this?" he asked, not unkindly, but guarded. "This is Mason," Marianne said. "He stayed with Elliot in the storm." Caleb's gaze lingered on Mason's stance, the dog at heel, the controlled stillness. "Thanks," he said after a beat. "I appreciate it." The words were correct, if not warm. A nurse appeared and waved Marianne forward with a practiced smile. "He's in recovery," she said. Relief rippled through the small group. Marianne squeezed Mason's arm in passing. Gratitude transmitted through touch rather than speech. Caleb hesitated, then nodded to Mason again, a small concession. When the immediate crisis passed, the hospital's quiet expanded. Mason stood, stretched, and clipped Rex's leash. He felt the tug of town, questions, paperwork, the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding. He could leave now. He could go back to the cabin, to the trees that didn't ask him to explain himself. Instead, he walked to the vending machines and bought a coffee that tasted like cardboard and resolve. He sipped it anyway. By afternoon, Leah Moreno called. Her voice over the phone was steady, efficient. "We secured the site," she said. "Survey team's coming tomorrow. I wanted you to hear it from me." "Thank you," Mason replied. "There's something else," Leah added. "County wants statements, routine. No pressure." Mason closed his eyes briefly. "I'll come by," he said. "Tomorrow." He hung up and stared out the window at the parking lot where heat shimmered above asphalt. Rex leaned against his leg, sensing the shift. Mason rested a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself. The lines were drawing him back toward town whether he wanted them to or not. He returned to the cabin as the day cooled, packed light, and drove back into Ashland. The general store's bell rang when he stepped inside, and Sarah Keene looked up from a clipboard. She took him in with one glance, the set of his shoulders, the dust on his boots, the way Rex waited. "You found trouble," she said, not accusing, just observant. "Kid got hurt," Mason replied. "He's going to be okay." Sarah's mouth softened. "Good." She set the clipboard aside. "Word travels fast. Ranger was in earlier. People are talking." Mason nodded. "That's what I was afraid of." She studied him, gray-blue eyes direct. "You don't look like someone who enjoys being talked about," she said. "But you also don't look like someone who'd walk away." Mason almost smiled. "I'm working on it." Outside, the town felt smaller than it had the night before. Familiar faces glanced his way, curious rather than hostile. He felt the old itch between his shoulder blades, the urge to disappear. He pushed through it and walked to the small municipal building where Leah had told him to go. Inside, he met Deputy Aaron Cole, a county deputy in his mid-30s with a compact build and a buzz cut that emphasized a scar along his temple. The scar, pale and clean, suggested an injury that had healed without erasing memory. Aaron's handshake was firm but not territorial. His eyes were tired in the way of someone who had seen enough to know better than to assume. "Just need your account," he said. "No theatrics." Mason gave it plainly. Facts, times, decisions. He didn't editorialize. Aaron nodded, typing, asking clarifying questions when needed. Rex lay at Mason's feet, unmoving. When it was done, Aaron leaned back. "You did right," he said, "for what it's worth." Mason stood. "I didn't do it for worth." Aaron smiled faintly. "Most people who do don't." That evening, Mason walked to the edge of Lithia Park, where the creek ran clear and cold, and sat on a bench with Rex. The town moved around them, joggers, families, a couple arguing softly under their breath. Normal life, persistent and indifferent. His phone buzzed. A text from Marianne. "He's awake. He asked for you." "Thank you again." Mason typed and erased twice before settling on a simple reply. "Glad he's okay. Rest now." As the light faded, Mason felt the choice settle into him. He could leave. He could also stay long enough to see this through, to answer questions, to be present, to let the forest and the town intersect without him vanishing between them. Rex lifted his head and looked at him, tail thumping once. Mason laughed under his breath. "All right," he said, "we'll stay a bit." He rose and headed back toward the cabin, the town's lights coming on one by one behind him. The lines that had drawn him back weren't chains, they were threads. And for the first time in a long while, Mason didn't mind being woven in. The county office sat on the edge of Ashland, like a building that wanted to be useful without being noticed. Mason Caldwell arrived early, the way he always did when something mattered. Rex walked at his side, nails clicking softly on the concrete, head level, eyes alert but calm. The morning carried the thin warmth of late summer, sun already bright but not yet punishing, the kind of light that made people believe problems could be solved if they were addressed early enough. Inside, the conference room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Leah Moreno stood near the window, sleeves rolled, braid resting over one shoulder, reviewing a set of aerial photos laid out on the table. She looked up when Mason entered and nodded, professional but not distant. Tom Kersey was already there, hat in his lap, weathered hands folded loosely. He looked smaller indoors, as if walls compressed a man who belonged under open sky. A third person stood at the far end of the room, studying the photos with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He introduced himself when Mason approached, Dr. Paul Hendricks, early 60s, tall but stooped, with a long, narrow face and wire-frame glasses that slid down his nose no matter how often he pushed them back. His hair was white and thinning, pulled into a short tail at the nape of his neck. His hands bore ink stains and small scars from decades of fieldwork. There was an eagerness in him that hadn't dulled with age, a scholar's hunger sharpened by years of near misses. "I specialize in regional mining history," he said, voice gentle but animated, "and what you found, or rather, didn't disturb, matters more than you might realize." Mason sat, keeping Rex close. "We didn't find it to find anything," he said evenly. "We were getting out of the weather." Leah smiled slightly at that. "Which may have saved us all a lot of trouble," she said. She tapped a photo showing the root ball and the faint outline of the concealed entrance. "The survey team confirmed it's a 19th century cache, likely tied to an unregistered prospecting operation, unstable, not a tourist attraction." Dr. Hendricks nodded vigorously. "Exactly. These sites were meant to disappear. Men hid what they couldn't carry, and sometimes they never returned. The stories don't usually end well." He paused, studying Mason over his glasses. "The fact that you chose restraint tells me more about you than any report could." Mason didn't respond. Praise made him uneasy. It slid off him without sticking. What mattered was that Elliot was safe and that the chamber remained intact. Leah slid a folder across the table. "There will be interest," she said. "Speculation. We'll secure the area and release a controlled statement. No names unless you want them used." "I don't," Mason said immediately. Tom cleared his throat. "I'll keep an eye on the trails," he offered. "People get curious when they hear words like history." "Thank you," Leah said. She closed the folder. "That's all for now." When they stepped outside, the sun had climbed higher, warming the air. Dr. Hendricks lingered, clearly reluctant to leave the subject behind. "If you ever want to talk," he said to Mason, handing over a card, "about the place, not the contents. There's value in understanding why people hid things at all." Mason took the card, nodded once, and tucked it into his pocket. He watched as the historian walked away, shoulders hunched against an invisible wind. Rex shifted, sensing Mason's tension. Mason scratched behind the dog's ears, grounding himself in the familiar. The day unfolded with small demands. Mason stopped by the hospital again, where Elliot lay propped up in bed, leg elevated, a cartoon playing softly on the muted television. The boy looked smaller under the white sheets, but his eyes were bright. "They say I get a cast tomorrow," he announced, proud. "And then crutches." "You'll master them," Mason said. "Just don't race anyone." Elliot grinned. Marianne hovered nearby, gratitude etched into her posture. Caleb stood back, arms crossed, watching Mason with a guarded respect that hadn't been there before. When Mason left, Caleb spoke up. "You ever need anything?" he said, awkward but sincere. "We owe you." Mason nodded, accepting the sentiment without collecting the debt. That evening, Ashland buzzed with a low current of rumor. Mason felt it in the way conversations paused when he entered a room, in the sidelong glances that carried curiosity more than judgment. At the general store, Sarah Keene rang up his purchases and slid a sandwich across the counter without comment. "On the house," she said quietly, "for the kid." "Thank you," Mason replied. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that kindness didn't need an audience. Outside, Rex paused, ears forward. Mason followed his gaze and saw a man leaning against a lamppost across the street, watching the store. The man was in his early 40s, lean to the point of sharpness, with a patchy beard and restless hands that kept adjusting the brim of his cap. His clothes were clean but worn thin, and there was a tension in him that didn't belong to simple curiosity. When Mason met his eyes, the man looked away too quickly. Mason didn't pursue. He made a note of it and kept walking. Back at the cabin, the forest greeted him with the steady sounds of evening. He fed Rex, cleaned his gear, and sat on the porch as dusk gathered. The world felt close in a way that surprised him. Town lights visible through the trees, responsibilities lining up where solitude had been. He was weighing whether that closeness was a threat when Rex rose and went to the edge of the clearing, nose lifting. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Tom Kersey emerged from the trees. Hazel's reins looped over his arm. The mare stood calm behind him, tail swishing lazily. "Didn't want to spook you," Tom said. "Thought I'd check in." Mason gestured to the steps. Tom sat, exhaling. "You're doing all right?" he asked. Mason considered the question. "I'm adjusting." Tom nodded. "Town'll do that. Draw you in whether you plan for it or not." He hesitated. "I saw someone nosing around the old trailhead. Not a hiker, too intent. I sent him the other way. Mason's jaw tightened slightly. Same guy I saw near the store, he said. Tom's eyes sharpened. Then it's not nothing. He glanced toward the darkening forest. People hear stories. Some come looking. I'm not interested in what's buried, Mason said. I'm interested in keeping people safe. That might mean the same thing for a while, Tom replied. They sat in silence as night settled. Rex lay between them, a solid presence. The forest hummed, insects beginning their chorus. Somewhere far off, a truck backfired, and Mason felt the familiar jolt in his chest. He breathed through it, counted Rex's breaths, let the moment pass. When Tom stood to leave, he rested a hand on Mason's shoulder, brief and steady. You did right, he said again. That matters. After Tom and Hazel disappeared into the trees, Mason went inside and lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep came slowly, threaded with half-dreams of stone and rain and a boy's steady breathing. Near dawn, he woke to Rex's soft huff and the sense of being watched. He rose, peered out the window, and saw nothing but trees shifting in the first light. Whatever had been stirred by the storm, and the story was still out there, moving quietly. Mason knew one thing with certainty. Some things were better left buried, but the responsibility to protect them had a way of surfacing. He rolled his shoulders, clipped Rex's leash, and stepped outside to meet the day, ready to draw whatever lines were necessary to keep what mattered intact. The trouble announced itself without sound. Mason Caldwell noticed it first as an absence. The insects that usually stitched the dust together fell quiet all at once, as if someone had pinched the air. Rex lifted his head from the cabin floor, ears forward, body still. Outside, the late summer sky had gone the color of tarnished copper, clouds stacked low and unmoving, holding the day's heat like a grudge. Mason stood and slipped on his boots, movements economical, the way they had become over years of learning what not to waste. He clipped Rex's leash, then unhooked it again. Close, he murmured. Rex understood the difference. They moved into the trees with the kind of care that came from respect rather than fear. Mason followed a narrow cut in the undergrowth that he had not made, leaves bruised and bent in a way that didn't belong to deer. He smelled cigarette smoke, stale, ground into fabric, and something chemical that reminded him of cheap fuel. The man Tom had warned about had returned, and he hadn't come to look. The forest thinned near the old trailhead. Moonlight caught on metal, a shovel propped against a stump, a coil of rope, the open tailgate of a dusty sedan parked where no car should be. Mason crouched and waited, counting breaths. Rex sank beside him, muscles tight, eyes locked on the dark beyond the tailgate. A man stepped into view, the same lean figure Mason had seen across from the store. In the moonlight, his features sharpened into something hard-edged and restless. He was mid-40s, angular face shadowed by a patchy beard, cheekbones sharp enough to look like they cut. His hair was thinning at the temples, slicked back with sweat, and his hands shook as he worked the shovel into the ground. He wore gloves that were too big, sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms mottled with old burns. His name, Mason would learn later, was Dylan Frost, and the things that had shaped him were not single events but a long chain of almosts, almost making it, almost being right, almost being forgiven. He talked to himself as he dug, a low mutter that carried bitterness rather than madness. They think they can lock it up, he said. They think I won't see. Mason shifted, testing angles. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted the man gone, the place intact. He raised his phone and snapped a photo, then another, documenting the tools, the car, the act. The click was barely audible, but Frost stiffened. He turned, eyes darting, breath quickening. "Who's there?" he barked, shovel raised like a poor substitute for courage. Rex stepped forward into the edge of the light, silent and sudden. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bare teeth. He simply stood, a dark shape with eyes that didn't blink. Frost swore and stumbled back, tripping over the rope. "Get it away from me," he shouted, voice cracking. Mason rose, hands open, voice level. "Drop the shovel," he said. "This doesn't need to get worse." Frost laughed, high and brittle. "You think you own this place?" He swung the shovel once, wide and wild, catching only air. Rex didn't move. The dog's restraint was the most dangerous thing in the clearing. Mason took a step closer, choosing timing over speed. "County's watching," he said. "Rangers, deputies. You're not digging anything up tonight." Frost's eyes flicked to the car, calculation flashing. He bolted. Rex moved then, a blur of controlled power. He cut Frost off at the tailgate, body angled to block without striking, a textbook maneuver. Frost skidded to a halt, breath ragged, panic finally breaking through bravado. He dropped to his knees, hands up. "Call him off!" he yelled. Mason did. Rex sat instantly, gaze never leaving Frost. Mason stepped in and cuffed Frost's wrists with a zip tie from his pocket. He'd carried them since the war, a habit that never quite left. He guided Frost to the ground, careful not to escalate. "Stay," he said, not to the man, but to the dog. Rex stayed. Sirens approached minutes later, distant at first, then closer, their sound slicing through the trees. Deputy Aaron Cole arrived with another unit, lights painting the clearing in red and blue. Aaron took in the scene, eyes flicking from Frost to the tools to Rex at heel. "You okay?" he asked Mason. "Yeah," Mason said. He wasn't. They walked Frost to the cruiser. As Aaron read him his rights, Frost slumped, defiance draining out of him. "I just needed it," he muttered. "I had a map. I knew it was there." His voice wavered. "I needed it." Aaron closed the door gently. "Needing doesn't make it yours," he said. The deputies took statements, cataloged tools, and marked the ground. Leah Moreno arrived last, jacket thrown on over sleep-worn clothes, braid loose. She surveyed the damage with a tight mouth. "This is why we secure," she said. Then she looked at Mason. "Thank you." The forest breathed again once the lights receded. Mason walked back to the cabin with Rex, adrenaline ebbing into something heavier. He sat on the porch steps and let the night finish its work. His phone buzzed. A message from Marianne. Elliot's asking when he can see Rex. Mason smiled, a small thing that surprised him. Sleep came fitfully. Just before dawn, Mason woke to a knock. Sarah Keene stood on the porch, coffee in a thermos, hair still pulled into its habitual knot. "Heard there was excitement," she said. "Thought you might need this." "Thank you," Mason said, accepting the cup. They stood in companionable silence, watching the light creep into the trees. "You're staying," Sarah said, not a question. "For now," Mason replied. She nodded. "Good." Later that morning, Tom Kersey rode up with Hazel, reins loose. He looked relieved. "Forrest answered," he said simply. Mason looked toward the trailhead, now quiet, and felt the line settle between past and present. He hadn't sought this role, but it had found him anyway. Some things were meant to stay buried. Others, like responsibility, surfaced when called. Morning settled over Ashland with a steadiness that felt earned. The late summer heat returned, but without the edge it had carried before. Sunlight filtering through the trees in clean bands that made the dust sparkle instead of choke. Mason Caldwell stood on the porch of the cabin and listened to the forest wake. Jays complaining, insects stitching the air back together, the distant hum of town life resuming its patient rhythm. Rex lay at his feet, stretched long, muzzle on his paws, eyes half closed but attentive, the posture of a dog who knew the difference between danger and the memory of it. The call came just after 9. Leah Moreno's voice was calm, a note of satisfaction tucked beneath the professionalism. "Charges are filed," she said. Frost pled out. Trespass, attempted theft of cultural property, tools confiscated. The site's secured. Fencing went up this morning. "Good," Mason said. He felt the word land solidly in him, not triumphant, just complete. "There's more," Leah added. "County approved a temporary stewardship program. Limited access, educational oversight. We could use someone with backcountry experience and a steady head." She paused. "I put your name forward." Mason didn't answer right away. He looked down at Rex, who lifted his head as if he could hear the question forming. "I'll come in," Mason said at last. "We'll talk." By noon, the municipal building's small meeting room filled with a different energy than before. Tom Kersey leaned against the wall, hat in hand, posture relaxed now that the worst had passed. Dr. Paul Hendricks hovered near a whiteboard, sketching timelines and routes with the absorbed enthusiasm of someone finally allowed to do things carefully. Deputy Aaron Cole stood near the door, arms folded, the scar at his temple catching the light as he listened. Sarah Keene slipped in quietly with a tray of sandwiches, setting them down without comment, her presence an unspoken endorsement. Leah outlined the plan. The chamber would remain closed except for supervised documentation. The story told would focus on preservation, not treasure. Patrols would increase until the rumor cycle burned itself out. "This isn't about claiming," she said. "It's about keeping." Mason spoke when it mattered. He didn't argue or posture. He asked practical questions, access points, signage, emergency protocols. He offered what he knew, how people moved when they thought they were unseen, how curiosity turned to risk when left unmanaged. Rex lay at his feet, occasionally shifting, a quiet metronome to Mason's thoughts. When the meeting ended, Leah lingered. "We'd want you as a volunteer coordinator," she said. "Stipend, flexible. You'd train folks on safety and leave no trace. Bring Rex when appropriate." Mason nodded. "We'll try it," he said. The word "we" surprised him. Rex's tail thumped once. That afternoon, Mason drove to Medford. Elliot Harper waited by the window, cast bright white against tanned skin, crutches propped awkwardly nearby. His grin broke wide when he saw Rex. "He came," Elliot crowed. Rex padded forward and sat, tail sweeping the floor in careful arcs. Elliot reached down, fingers brushing the dog's collar, reverent. "They're letting me go home tomorrow," he said. "Mom says I'll have chores that don't involve legs." Marianne Harper stood behind him, relief softening her features. Caleb Wright hovered near the door, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes tired but clearer than before. He stepped forward, awkward as ever. "We're working on things," he said to Mason. "Elliot's been—" He searched for the word. "Brave," Mason nodded. "He has." As Mason turned to leave, Elliot called after him. "Will I see the forest again?" "When you're ready," Mason said. "And when you listen." Elliot nodded, serious. "I will." The days that followed fell into a rhythm Mason hadn't known he missed. Mornings in the woods with Tom, marking trails and setting gentle boundaries. Afternoons in town, answering questions, redirecting curiosity toward care. Evenings on the porch with Rex, the dog's breathing steady as a heartbeat he could borrow. Sarah stopped by once with a loaf of bread still warm, then again with a book she thought he'd like. They talked in the way people do when they aren't trying to impress. About weather, about work, about the patience it takes to stay. One evening, Leah brought a group of volunteers out to the trailhead. Mason showed them how to read the ground without disturbing it, how to spot the signs that meant stop rather than go. Rex demonstrated controlled presence, a lesson in restraint more than force. People listened. They learned. At the end of the week, Mason walked alone to the edge of the fenced area, stopping where the trees thickened and the ground rose toward the hidden chamber. He didn't cross the line. He didn't need to. The forest felt balanced again, as if a weight had been set back where it belonged. Rex sat beside him, head tilted. Mason scratched the spot behind the dog's ear, the one that made his leg twitch. "We did okay," Mason said. Rex agreed in the only way that mattered, by staying. That night, Ashland hosted a small gathering in the park. Nothing official, just food, music, the soft clatter of normal life asserting itself. Elliot came on crutches, beaming, cast signed with jokes and drawings. Marianne laughed more easily than Mason had seen. Caleb hovered less. Tom showed up late and left early, content. Dr. Hendricks told stories that ended with questions rather than conclusions. Sarah stood beside Mason, shoulder brushing his, comfortable. When the sun dipped and lights came on, Mason felt the old pull toward leaving, toward the simplicity of motion without attachment. He let it pass. He had learned the difference between being trapped and being anchored. One was fear, the other was choice. As the night wound down, Mason walked back toward the cabin with Rex. The forest met them halfway, familiar and forgiving. He stopped at the porch and looked back once toward town lights and voices, then forward into the trees. The ground under his boots felt firm. Some things stayed buried. Some things, like a life, were meant to be tended. Mason took a breath, steady and deep, and stepped inside, closing the door not as an ending, but as a promise kept. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles with thunder or fire. Sometimes he sends them quietly, in the form of a man who chooses to stop, a dog who refuses to walk past suffering, or a stranger who stays when it would be easier to leave. This story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly abandoned. God often works through ordinary people, through simple acts of courage, compassion, and patience. In our daily lives, we may not face storms in the forest, but we all face moments of fear, loneliness, and doubt. And maybe, just maybe, you are meant to be the quiet miracle in someone else's life today. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe that no child, no soul, and no living being should ever face fear alone, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories of light. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your path. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and hope to every step you take. Amen.